The room smelled of old paper and floor cleaner. It was a smell that suggested waiting and worry and endings. The boy sat on a hard wooden bench, his feet not quite touching the scuffed linoleum floor. He was small for 12, wearing a gray sweatshirt that was a little too big, the sleeves covering half his hands. He kept his eyes on a particular scuff mark near his shoes, tracing its shape over and over with his mind. It was easier than looking up. Beside him sat his social worker, a woman named Anya. She had a kind face, but today it was lined with a deep tiredness. She held a thick beige folder on her lap, her fingers tapping lightly on its edge. The folder contained the story of the boy's life, at least the official version. It was full of school reports that said, capable but disengaged, notes from meetings about his truancy, and letters from landlords about the noise. It was the story of a mother who loved her son but was losing a long, slow battle with her own demons, and a boy who had become a ghost in the system, floating from problem to temporary solution to bigger problem dot at the front of the room. Behind a high wooden desk sat Judge Martin. He wasn't a cruel man. In his younger days, he might have been described as idealistic, but 30 years in family court had sanded down the edges of that idealism. He saw patterns, and the pattern sitting in front of him was one he'd seen 100 times before. The absent parent, the struggling child, the overworked social worker with a folder of failed interventions. He looked at the boy, a pale face, a mop of unkempt hair, shoulders hunched forward, and saw not a person, but a case file about to be sent down a certain, inevitable path. So, Judge Martin said, his voice filling the quiet room, "We're back." He adjusted his glasses and opened his own copy of the file. School attendance is below 10%. The last supported living arrangement broke down due to behavioral incidents. He didn't read the details aloud. The boy had been there. Your mother, the judge continued, a slight softening in his tone, is not in a position to provide stability. We have tried the mentoring scheme. We have tried the weekly check-ins. We have tried the alternative learning program. With each we have tried, the boy seemed to shrink a little further into his sweatshirt. Anya placed a gentle hand on his arm, but he didn't react. The local authority's recommendation, Judge Martin said, leaning back in his leather chair, which gave a soft groan, is for a secure residential placement, a structured environment, to address the educational gaps and the behavioral issues. The words hung in the air. Secure residential placement. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Fences, routines, kids who were harder than him. It was where you went when there were no other options left. Anya cleared her throat. Your Honor, if I may? The judge nodded, a gesture that said asterisk you may, but it likely won't change anything asterisk. Jesse, Anya said, using the boy's name deliberately, has been through a tremendous amount. The chaos, the instability. It's a trauma response, not deliberate defiance. Before we take the step of a secure placement, which can be re-traumatizing, there is one more avenue. The Harmony Project. It's a music-based intervention program for young people exactly in his situation. It's not just lessons. It's therapy. It's mentorship. It's a community. He's expressed an interest in music. I've seen him, fascinated by a piano in a community center. I believe there's a spark there. If we could just get him a spot? Judge Martin listened, but his expression was one of weary skepticism. He'd heard of these programs. Well-meaning, underfunded, often delivering little but false hope. He looked from Anya's earnest face to the boy, who was now picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Music lessons, the judge stated, not asked. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Ms. Anya, with respect, this young man is facing the complete breakdown of his education and his social development. He needs boundaries. He needs discipline. He needs to be in an environment where he cannot run away from his responsibilities. A piano lesson once a week is not going to provide that. It's more than that, Your Honor. It's about connection. It's about giving him a voice. He has a voice, the judge interrupted, his patience thinning. He used it to shout at his support worker last month, according to this report. He used it to refuse to go to school 90% of the time. He put his glasses back on and looked directly at the boy for the first time in several minutes. Son, do you even want to go to this music project? The boy, Jesse, flinched at being addressed. He glanced up, his eyes meeting the judge's for a fleeting second before darting back to the floor. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. It was a gesture of such profound helplessness that it annoyed the judge further. Here was a life hanging in the balance, and the child couldn't even muster a yes or no. See? Judge Martin said, turning back to Anya. This is what we're dealing with. Apathy. Resignation. We cannot build a future on that. The state's resources are limited. We have to use them where they will have the greatest, most certain impact. He closed the file folder with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. I appreciate your advocacy, Miss Anya. Truly I do. But we have to be realistic. We've run out of time for experiments. My job is to ensure his safety and his education, and right now, a secure unit is the only proposal before me that promises both. He reached for his pen, ready to sign the order. This was it. The end of the discussion. The boy's fate was about to be sealed with a few strokes of a pen. Anya's shoulders slumped. She had fought so hard. She looked at Jesse, his head bowed, and felt a wave of crushing defeat. She had failed him, but as the judge's pen hovered over the paper, she remembered something. A tiny moment, weeks ago, in a dusty community hall. She had been looking for Jesse and found him not in the games room, but standing perfectly still in a corner of the main hall, staring at an old, out-of-tune upright piano. An older man was playing something simple, and Jesse was watching his hands as if they were performing magic. He hadn't noticed her for a full 5 minutes. It was the most focused, the most present she had ever seen him. It was the slimmest of straws, but it was all she had left. Your Honor, she said, her voice quiet but suddenly clear. I understand your decision, but before you sign, would you indulge us for 2 minutes? Just 2. Judge Martin paused, his pen still in the air. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation of a man being asked for one more unreasonable thing at the end of a long day. Indulge you how? There's a piano, Anya said, her words coming out in a rush. In the anteroom next door. The court clerk's. He practices during lunch. Jesse, just let him sit at it. Let him show you. Not with words. He's not good with words. But just let him show you what he can do. 2 minutes. That's all I ask. Then, if you still feel the same, you sign the order. And we'll go. The judge stared at her. It was an absurd request. Unprofessional, even. This was a courtroom, not a talent show. He was about to refuse, to tell her that this was precisely the kind of sentimental time-wasting he could not afford. The words were on his lips. Stop wasting our time. He looked at the boy, a silent, crumpled figure on the bench. He looked at the closed file, the path of least resistance. Then, against every instinct bred by 3 decades on the bench, he felt a flicker of something, not hope, but a faint, tired curiosity. What did this woman see that he did not? What could possibly be demonstrated in 2 minutes that would change anything? He lowered his pen. Very well, he said, his voice flat. 2 minutes. But that is all. He stood up, his robes rustling. Bailiff, Would you escort us to the music room? And so the strange procession moved. The judge in his formal robes, the baffled bailiff, the social worker with a heart pounding against her ribs, and the small, silent boy led from a room of judgment to a room that held, though none of them knew it yet, the possibility of a different kind of verdict altogether. The room they entered next door was a different world. It wasn't a courtroom. It felt more like a forgotten corner of a library. The air was cooler and smelled faintly of wood polish and dust. Sunlight streamed in weakly through a tall, narrow window, catching on the motes of dust floating in the air. The walls were lined with dark, heavy bookshelves, filled with leather-bound legal volumes that no one probably touched anymore. And there, standing in a patch of that weak sunlight, was the piano dot. It was a grand piano, much bigger than the old upright the boy had seen at the community center. Its surface was a deep, glossy black, like still water in the night. It looked important and expensive, and it seemed to take up all the space in the room, not just physically, but with its presence. The boy stopped just inside the door, his eyes locked on it. The scuff mark on his shoe, the worried face of his social worker, the judge's impatient sigh, all of it faded into a dull background. Humdot, the judge walked over and stood by the window, leaning against the wall. He crossed his arms, his robes draping heavily. He didn't look at the piano. He looked at his watch, then at the boy. His expression said, "Well, get on with it." "The clock is ticking. Asterisk." The bailiff stood near the door, a large, quiet man trying to be invisible and failing. The social worker, Anya, stood just behind the boy. She gave his shoulder a small, encouraging squeeze. "It's okay," she whispered, but her voice was tight with her own fear. She had asked for this. Now she had to watch it happen. What if he just stood there? What if he froze? What if he hit a single wrong note, and the judge shook his head, and they walked right back into the other room? She felt like she'd pushed him onto a tiny, fragile raft and sent him out onto a huge, empty sea. The boy didn't seem to hear her. He took a slow, small step forward, then another. He moved toward the piano bench, as if pulled by a gentle, invisible string. The loudest sound in the room was the soft shuffle of his trainers on the wooden floor. He reached the bench. For a long moment, he just stood in front of it, looking down at the keys. They were a pattern of black and white, clean and perfect. He'd never touched keys so pristine. The community center piano had yellowed, chipped teeth, with names carved into its side. This one was like a sleeping animal. He sat down. The leather of the bench was cool and smooth. He was so small that when he sat, his feet dangled well above the pedals on the floor. He didn't seem to notice. He straightened his back, just a little, and let his hands rest in his lap. He stared at the keyboard, his head slightly tilted. The judge cleared his throat. A sharp, dry sound in the quiet. 2 minutes starts now, young man, he said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was a reminder. This was a transaction, a display. It had a time limit. The boy didn't turn. He didn't nod. He just kept looking at the keys. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The boy's hand stayed in his lap. The social worker felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She wanted to say something, to urge him, but her throat was closed tight. The judge shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He uncrossed his arms and checked his watch again. A full minute had gone by. Half their time. The boy had done nothing but sit and stare. The judge felt the familiar, weary feeling of being right. This was a farce. A child overwhelmed by a situation, intimidated by a fine instrument. He thought of the paperwork waiting on his desk, the other families waiting for their turn in his courtroom. This had been a mistake. A sentimental, time-wasting mistake. He opened his mouth, ready to call a halt to the whole thing. Asterisk enough. We've seen enough. Asterisk. But just as the breath was leaving his lungs to form the words, the boy moved Dot. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow, deliberate. He lifted his right hand from his lap. His fingers, which had seemed small and slightly grubby against his gray sleeves, now looked different. They hovered above the keys, not trembling, but alive with a strange, quiet potential. He didn't look at his hand. He looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance, as if reading music that was written on the air itself. Then his left hand came up to join the right. They hung there, poised. The judge closed his mouth. He didn't know why. Something in the boy's posture had changed. The slump was gone. In its place was a focus so intense it seemed to draw the light, and the silence of the room into it. The boy's fingers descended. They didn't strike the keys. They touched them. It was a soft, almost loving contact. And from the piano came not a single note, but a rich, low chord. It was a C minor chord, played gently, letting the sound bloom in the quiet room. The vibration hung in the air, warm and sad. The judge, who had heard this piece 100 times in concert halls and on recordings, felt the hair on the back of his neck stir. He knew those opening chords. Everyone knew them. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. But this wasn't just a recital. The boy played the famous slow triplets, not with robotic accuracy, but with a deep, aching pulse. Each note was given space to breathe, to decay into the next. There was a hesitation, a slight drag on the bass notes that wasn't in the sheet music. It was in the boy's bones. It spoke of long, lonely evenings, of waiting, of a sadness that was too heavy for words. The boy's eyes were half closed now. He wasn't in this dusty anteroom anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. His small hands, which seemed too small for the stretches the music required, found a way. He didn't play it with power, but with feeling. A feeling so raw and honest, it was almost uncomfortable to witness. The social worker, Anya, felt the tears come. Not because it was perfectly played, it wasn't. A note was muffled here and there. The tempo wavered. But because she was hearing him. For the first time, she was hearing the voice of the quiet, angry, lost boy she'd been driving to appointments and pleading with for months. This was his voice. This melody, this specific heartbreaking melody, was his story. The chaos, the loneliness, the yearning for something beautiful and ordered, it was all there, flowing out through his fingertips. The bailiff by the door had uncrossed his arms. He stood very still, his professional blankness replaced by a look of simple wonder. He didn't know Beethoven from pop songs, but he knew what pain sounded like, and he knew what truth sounded like. But the most profound change was in the judge. His arms were no longer crossed. He was no longer leaning against the wall. He had taken a small, unconscious step forward. The impatience, the skepticism, the weariness had been wiped from his face as if by a cloth. His eyes, behind his glasses, were wide. He was a man who had built a career on listening to words, angry words, lying words, pleading words. He had become an expert in hearing the stories people told. But this was different. This was a story being felt and transmitted directly into the air, bypassing all the lies and defenses and official reports. He heard the technical imperfections, of course. The boy was clearly self-taught, but the judge, who loved this music, understood something deeper. Great technique could make you play the notes, but only a soul that understood darkness could make you hear the moonlight. The boy moved into the next section, his left hand maintaining that steady, funeral march rhythm, his right hand tracing the mournful melody. The sunlight from the window had moved slightly, now falling across his shoulders and onto the piano keys, making them gleam. The dust motes danced in the beam, looking like tiny stars, caught in the sound waves. The 2 minutes had come and gone. No one was counting. The judge had forgotten his watch, his next case, his entire docket. He was simply a man, listening. The boy played on, and in that simple, sunlit room, a lifetime of judgments was being quietly, beautifully overturned. The music didn't fill the room in the way you might think. It didn't boom or echo. It seeped into it. It soaked into the old wooden bookshelves, into the heavy velvet curtains, into the very bones of the building. It was a quiet, persistent tide of sound, each wave of notes washing over the 3 adults who stood frozen in their places. The boy was gone. The small, hunched figure in the too big sweatshirt had vanished. In his place was a vessel for something else. His body moved with the music, not with big, dramatic sweeps, but with small, necessary shifts. A slight lean to the left to press a deeper bass note. A gentle rocking forward as the right-hand melody climbed, note by aching note, searching for a resolution it wouldn't yet find. His face was calm, but not empty. A faint line of concentration was etched between his eyebrows. His lips were slightly parted, as if he was breathing for the piano, giving it the air it needed to speak. He wasn't reading music. He was remembering something, or feeling something. His fingers, which had looked clumsy and idle before, now moved with a strange, ancient knowledge. They knew where to go. They found the spaces between the black keys. They stretched for intervals that should have been too big for his hands. And they did it all without a single glance down. The social worker, Anya, had brought a hand to her mouth. She was trying to hold in the sob that was building in her chest. She wasn't crying just because it was beautiful. She was crying because it was a confession. All those silent car rides, all those one-word answers, all the shrugged shoulders and slammed doors, this was what had been inside. This deep, resonant sadness. This was the boy who sat alone in his room while the world argued outside his door. This was the boy who walked the streets instead of going to school, carrying a loneliness so heavy it had curved his spine. She heard it all. Every missed lesson, every empty cupboard, every broken promise was in those slow, deliberate chords. She looked at the judge. She needed to see his reaction. He was the one who mattered. Judge Martin had not moved from his spot, but he was a different man. The imposing figure in robes was gone. He looked smaller, older, and utterly captivated. His glasses had slid a little down his nose, but he didn't push them back. His stern, practiced expression of impartiality had melted away, leaving behind something raw and unguarded. His eyes were fixed on the boy's hands, and on his face, then back to his hands, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. He knew this piece. He had a recording of it by a famous pianist at home. He would listen to it sometimes on difficult evenings, finding a companion in its sorrow. But this was not a performance. This was an autopsy of a feeling. The famous pianist played the grief with control and grandeur. This boy played it with the fresh, ragged edges of someone who was still living inside it. The judge heard the slight stumble in the rhythm, not a mistake, but a hesitation, as if the memory of the pain was too sharp just then. He heard the way the melody notes were sometimes held a fraction too long, clinging to the sound before letting it fade. Unwilling to let the silence back in Dot, it was the most honest thing he had heard in his courtroom in 30 years. The bailiff, a man named Ray, who had seen everything from screaming matches to silent tears in his 2 decades of service, felt a thickness in his own throat. He thought of his grandson, who was about this boy's age, safe and loved, and taking guitar lessons he sometimes complained about. He looked at this kid, pouring his heart out through a borrowed piano in a last, desperate bid to be seen, and a hot wave of protectiveness surged through him. He wanted to stand between this boy and the bleak future the judge had been about to sign off on. For the first time in a long career of following orders, he felt a personal stake in the outcome. The music continued, unfolding its sad story. The boy moved into a slightly more agitated section, the left hand's rhythm becoming more insistent, the right hand's melody twisting with a quiet anguish. His small body tensed with the effort. A sheen of sweat glistened at his temples. He was putting everything he had into it, not to impress, but because he didn't know any other way to play. This was his language, and he was speaking his only truth. Judge Martin found his own mind drifting, pulled by the music away from the law books and the procedures. He wasn't thinking about residential placements or statutory guidelines. He was thinking about a summer house his family had rented when he was a boy. He remembered an old, out-of-tune piano on the sun porch. He remembered his aunt, a stern woman who rarely smiled, sitting at it one rainy afternoon and playing this merry piece. He had hidden behind the door and listened, stunned that such beauty could come from someone he thought was so cold. He had never looked at her the same way again. This boy was teaching him the same lesson. People are not their files. They are not their worst moments, or their attendance records, or the sum of their problems. They are hidden rooms, and sometimes the door is locked. And sometimes the only key is a sequence of notes on a piano. The final section of the first movement returned, the theme coming back like a remembered pain. It was slower now, even more weary. The boy's energy was flagging, the emotional toll showing in the slight droop of his shoulders. But his fingers remained sure. They found the final descending notes, each one softer than the last, a sigh fading into nothing. He played the last chord, a simple, resolved minor chord. He held the pedal down, letting the sound vibrate and shimmer in the sunlit air for a long, long time. Then, very slowly, he lifted his fingers. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with everything that had just been said. It was a respectful, almost holy silence. The boy's hands settled back into his lap. The focused, faraway look in his eyes dimmed. The small, nervous child seemed to flow back into his body. He slumped just a little and stared at the keys he had just brought to life, as if surprised to see them there. No one spoke. No one knew how the judge was the first to break the spell. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved. He walked forward, his steps slow and quiet on the wooden floor. He didn't go to the social worker. He didn't consult the bailiff. He walked right up to the side of the grand piano and stopped, looking down at the boy. The boy finally looked up. His eyes were wide, a little scared again, waiting for the verdict. Was it enough? Had he wasted their time after all? Judge Martin looked at him for a long moment. His face was unreadable. Then he did something no one in that room, least of all the boy, expected. He pulled out the small, polished wooden bench that was tucked near the bookshelf for the court clerk. He sat down on it, right next to the piano bench, so he was almost at eye level with the boy. He wasn't towering over him anymore. He was just a man sitting with a child. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was different. It wasn't the formal, booming courtroom voice. It was quieter, softer. It had cracks in it. "Son," he said, "where did you learn to play like that?" The boy flinched at the question. It was so quiet, so close. He was used to the judge's voice, coming from high up, behind a big desk. This was different. This felt like being talked to by a person, not by the law. He looked at the man's face, searching for the impatience, the dismissal. He couldn't find it. The judge's eyes were just waiting. He glanced over at his social worker. She gave him a tiny, encouraging nod, her eyes still shiny. He swallowed, his throat dry. The place, he started, his own voice a rough whisper. He cleared it, tried again. The community center, by the old flats. They have a room." He stopped, as if that explained everything. The judge just waited, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't rush him. "There's a piano there," the boy continued, looking back at the black keys in front of him. Talking about it was harder than playing it. "It's old. Some of the keys stick, and some don't make a sound at all." His fingers twitched in his lap, mimicking the action. "There's a man. He comes on Tuesdays. He plays, not songs, just makes it up." He paused again, gathering the memories. "I'd just sit on the floor, over by the radiator, and listen. He never talked to me, just played. Then he'd leave." The boy's voice grew a little stronger, lost in the telling. "One Tuesday he didn't come. The room was empty. The piano was just there." He looked up at the judge, as if to see if he was following. The judge gave a small, understanding nod, so I went over to it. I pressed one of the white keys. Just one. Ding. He tapped a single finger in the air. It was so loud in the quiet. Then I pressed the one next to it, and I thought, those two sounds, they go together. They're friends. A faint, almost invisible smile touched the judge's lips. It was gone in a second, but the boy saw it. I started going after school. When the room was empty, I'd just find the friends, the keys that sounded right together. I found a pattern. 3 notes, slow, like this. He hummed a few of the opening notes of the Moonlight Sonata, terribly off-key, and the contrast between his humming and the beauty he'd just played was so stark it was almost funny. But no one laughed. I heard it once. On the telly. In a shop. I didn't know what it was called, but I remembered the feeling of it. So I went back and I tried to find those friends on the keys. It took a long time. Weeks. I'd get a bit of it, then forget. Then remember another bit. He looked down at his hands. My hands were too small. I had to cheat. Roll my finger to hit the next note sometimes. He demonstrated on his knee, his small index finger rolling from an imaginary key to another. The movement was practiced, a workaround born of necessity. The judge was listening with an intensity he usually reserved for closing arguments. He wasn't just hearing a story about learning piano. He was hearing a story about solving a problem, about finding order in chaos, about using sheer will and feeling to bridge a gap that formal lessons would have filled with theory and sheet music. This wasn't a hobby. This was a survival mechanism. "Do you read music?" The judge asked softly. The boy shook his head, a quick, definite movement. "No. The man on Tuesdays, he left a book once, with the lines and the dots. It looked like a different language. I listen, and then I find it. Asterisk, I just listen, and then I find it. Asterisk, the sentence hung in the dusty, sunlit air. The social worker, Anya, understood now. The silence she'd mistaken for apathy wasn't emptiness. It was him listening. To the world, to the fragments of music in it, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. The judge took a deep breath. He looked from the boy's earnest, worried face to the magnificent piano, then over to the social worker. His mind, trained for decades to weigh evidence and make swift decisions, was already made up. It had been made up from the 3rd bar of the sonata. Everything that followed, the story, the rolled finger on the knee, was just confirmation. He stood up. The moment of quiet intimacy was over. The judge was back, but he was a different judge. He walked to the center of the room, his robe swishing with purpose. He looked at the bailiff. "Ray, could you give us the room for a moment, please? Just Miss Anya and myself and the young man." The bailiff, Ray, nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He gave the boy one last kind look and stepped out, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind him. The judge turned to the social worker. His voice was crisp now, clear, full of decision. The application for the secure residential placement is withdrawn. I am striking it from the record. Anya's breath left her in a sharp gasp of relief. Her knees felt weak. Instead, the judge continued, I am mandating immediate placement in the Harmony Project, full enrollment. Not as a trial, as a primary intervention. He held up a finger, emphasizing the point. But it is not enough. A program like that will give him community and a piano to practice on. It will not give him a true teacher, not the kind he needs. He started to pace slowly, thinking aloud. He needs someone who understands that he speaks music before he speaks English. Someone who can take that raw feeling in his playing, and give it the vocabulary it lacks without crushing the spirit of it. He stopped and pointed a finger at Anya. You will find that teacher. I don't care if you have to call the Royal Academy of Music. You find a tutor who gets it. The local authority will fund it. I will sign the order. He then turned his gaze to the boy, who was watching him, utterly bewildered by this sudden, commanding flow of words. And he needs an instrument. He cannot learn on a broken community center piano with silent keys. He needs something reliable. In his placement. Where he lives. Every day. Anya was scribbling notes frantically on a pad she'd pulled from her bag. Yes, Your Honor. Of course. I'll start the referrals today. An instrument. We might be able to get a digital keyboard through a grant. Not a keyboard, the judge said, his tone leaving no room for argument. A piano. An upright. Something with real strings, real hammers. He needs to feel the vibration in the floor. He walked back over to the grand piano and placed a hand gently on its lid. He may never play one this fine again, but he should have something that answers when he speaks to it. You make it happen. If there's bureaucracy, you tell them to call my chambers. He walked back to the boy and crouched down again, so their eyes were level. The formal tone was gone, replaced by a grave sincerity. What you did today, he said slowly, was not a trick. It was a testament. You used what you had to tell me who you are. That takes courage. More courage than I see in most people who walk into my court. Do you understand? The boy, overwhelmed, just nodded. The music is your gift. But it is also your responsibility now. This chance you've been given, it's not a free pass. It's an exchange. You work. You go to the program. You listen to your teacher, even when it's hard. You respect this gift. You honor it with your effort. Do you understand that? The boy nodded again, more firmly this time. The words were heavy, but they felt solid. They felt like a promise, and for the first time in a very long time, a promise felt like something that might actually be kept. Good, the judge said. He stood up, his knees cracking. He was just an older man again, tired but clear-eyed. Ms. Anya, draft the orders. I'll sign them before the end of the day. Get him something to eat on your way out. He looks piqued. He glanced once more at the piano and at the boy. Court is adjourned. He walked to the door, opened it, and was gone, his robes billowing behind him as he headed back to his world of files and formalities, leaving behind a silent room and two people whose world had just been utterly, irrevocably changed. The story doesn't end with a concert hall. There's no roaring crowd, no bouquet of flowers thrown onto a stage. Real life, the kind that starts in a dusty courtroom anteroom, rarely works that way. The truer path is quieter, harder, and more beautiful in its own way. The first piano was a rented upright, a mahogany-colored thing with a few scratches on its legs. It was delivered to the small, clean room in the supportive foster home where the boy now lived. It was the first thing he saw when he walked in. He didn't whoop or shout. He just walked over and pressed a middle C. The sound was pure, clear, and it didn't stick. He sat there for an hour, not playing a song, just testing every note, learning the voice of this new friend. The Harmony Project was exactly what it promised. It was noisy, chaotic, and full of other kids who carried their own hidden storms. There were drummers who pounded out their anger, guitarists who hid behind their hair, and singers who could barely whisper. He was quiet there too, at first, but he had his piano corner, and when he played, the room would often grow hushed. Not because he was the best, but because the feeling in his playing was a language they all understood, even if they couldn't speak it. His teacher, found through a stubborn campaign by his social worker, was a retired man named Mr. Ellis. He had kind eyes and hands that were gnarled with arthritis. He didn't start with sheet music. He started by asking, "Show me what you hear." The boy would play something a few chords, a melody he'd made up. Mr. Ellis would listen, nod, and say, "Good. Now here is what that's called. This is a C minor chord. This movement you're doing with your left hand, that's an arpeggio." He was building a bridge between the boy's heart and the world's knowledge, one careful plank at a time. It was slow. It was frustrating. Scales were boring. Theory was like a fog. But the boy remembered the judge's words. Asterisk, it's an exchange. You honor it with your effort. Asterisk school didn't become easy. Maths was still a wall of confusing numbers. But he went. His attendance, tracked by a now hopelessly invested social worker, climbed from 10% to 70, then 80. He had a reason to get up. The piano was there. The music was waiting. It was a tether to a better kind of day. The years turned. The boy grew taller. His hands stretched, finally able to reach the octaves properly. The foster home became a stable base, not a temporary stop. He played his first proper recital at the Harmony Project's annual show. He played a simplified version of the Moonlight Sonata. His foster carers were there, and Mr. Ellis and Anya, who still checked in on him. He was terrified. His hands shook, but he started, and the shaking stopped. When he finished, the applause was warm, from people who knew his journey. It felt better than imaginary cheers from a distant hall. He got a diploma. Not with top marks, but he got it. It was the first thing he'd ever truly finished. Mr. Ellis, by then quite frail, gave him a gift. A thick book of Beethoven's sonatas, with the moonlight marked by a faded ribbon. "Now you can read what you've been speaking," he said. The path led, not to a conservatory, but to a local college where he studied music therapy. It made sense to him. He had seen how the chaotic room at the Harmony Project calmed when music filled it. He understood how sound could reach places words couldn't. He learned the science of it, the psychology. But his real skill was the unteachable one. He remembered what it was to be that kid on the bench, speaking his only truth. And so, the circle began to turn. He started working part-time at the very same community center where the old, broken piano had once lived. They had a new one now, donated by a local charity. He ran a music group for teenagers who were, as the reports like to say, at risk. He didn't look like a social worker. He wore jeans and trainers. He had tattoos on his forearms, intricate designs of musical staves and waves. He didn't start with rules. He'd just sit at the piano and play something, maybe a bit of blues, maybe a film score, maybe a pop song he'd rearranged. The kids would hover, curious, defensive. "Can you play that drill beat?" A skeptical boy asked once, arms crossed. The young man didn't dismiss it. He listened to the beat on the boy's phone, his head nodding. Then he turned to the piano and replicated the complex, driving rhythm with a deep, percussive left hand and a dissonant, haunting right-hand melody over the top. It wasn't the same, but it spoke to it. The boy's jaw went slack. "All right," he muttered, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "All right." Sometimes he was asked to speak, not in big conferences, but in small, stark rooms. He would be a guest at a youth offender panel or in a training session for new social workers. He never used fancy words. He would tell them the story of the courtroom, the scuff mark on the floor, the judge's sigh, the feel of the cold piano bench, the 2 minutes that weren't. "I wasn't a good kid," he'd say plainly. "I was angry. I was lost. I failed at everything they asked me to do. But I had one thing, and if someone hadn't stopped to hear it, my life would have gone one way." They heard it, and it went another. He kept a box of his old life. Not much was in it. A photo of his mom from a better time. His first worn-down pair of headphones. And right at the bottom, beneath everything, a photocopied sheet of paper. It was the front page of the court order from that day. You could see where the judge had scrawled "withdrawn" in bold, angry letters across the original recommendation for a secure placement. And below it, in the same ink, the mandated instructions for the music program, a tutor, the instrument. It was the map that led him out. He didn't look at it often. But sometimes on a difficult day, when a kid he was working with slid backwards, or when the memories of the old chaos threatened to pull at him, he would take it out. He wouldn't read the words. He would just feel the weight of the paper and remember the sound of his own heart filling a silent room, and the face of a judge who chose, in one remarkable moment, to listen instead of to sentence. The final scene isn't a stage. It's a modest room in the community center, late on a Tuesday afternoon. Sunlight slants through high windows, just like it did in that anteroom long ago. He's in his mid-20s now. His hands move over the keys of the decent, well-tuned upright, playing a gentle, improvised melody for a group of kids who are drawing, talking softly, or just staring out the window. One girl, maybe 13, with a fierce scowl, is sitting on the floor by the radiator, just listening. She's been coming for weeks and hasn't said a word. He finishes the melody, and the room is quiet, peaceful. He catches the girl's eye. She looks away quickly. "Anything you want to hear?" He asks the room. The scowling girl doesn't look up, but her voice, rough and quiet, cuts through the air. "Do you know that sad one? The one that sounds like moonlight?" He feels a familiar, old shiver, a ghost from his past walking into the room. He doesn't say yes. He doesn't say no. He just turns back to the piano, takes a slow, deep breath, and lets his fingers find their way home. The first familiar, haunting notes fill the space. And as he plays, he knows the work is never really over. It just changes hands. He is no longer the boy on the bench. He is the guide in the room. He is the proof that a single heard note can change a life's entire song. And the music, once a solitary escape, has become a bridge reaching back to his own past and stretching forward, quietly, towards whoever needs to hear it next.